Welcome to the 20th Century History series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
Technology and strategy in 20th century wars. It is a sad truth about human civilization that we often resort to violence when we find ourselves in conflict with each other. During the 20th century alone, there has been over 120 wars, not including the smaller conflicts. The death toll of the largest wars, World War I and II, lie around 10 million and 40 million people respectively. At the moment, the United Nations is running 15 peacekeeping missions around the world, from Haiti in the west to Timor in Southeast Asia. Still, many of us have not experienced war firsthand, and we only know of it through newspapers, television, or movies. When we think of how much of our civilization had developed during the 20th century, how then has war developed? We will now make a brief survey over the main developments in warfare as it has changed during the 20th century because of new technology and new kinds of military strategy. We will look at changes in all three branches of a nation's defense: ground forces, naval war, and war in the air. And then we will consider the impact of nuclear war and mass destruction. Finally, we will look at the modern high-tech warfare based on information, satellite surveillance, and remote-controlled strikes. The development within each area of warfare is different. At the same time, there has been a long-term change from sending hordes of relatively poorly trained soldiers to mass deaths towards sending as few as 2 to 10 highly trained elite soldiers to carry out the same missions. At the same time, weaponry within naval and aerial warfare has kept developing, becoming more and more sophisticated and expensive. The result is a gap between richer and poorer nations. The poorer nations tend to lose the battles because they cannot afford sophisticated weapons. Instead, they still rely on sending masses of soldiers to their deaths. We will first look at developments within the ground forces. These are infantry, artillery, and armored vehicles, tanks. The tendency during the 20th century has been to reduce the numbers of soldiers fighting and instead giving them better training. The main characteristics of World War I would be trench warfare, the machine gun, and mass death. Trench warfare is defensive. From a trench dug into the ground, it is easy to fire thousands of bullets towards an advancing enemy. During the larger battles, such as the Battle of the Somme in the summer and autumn of 1916, 20,000 soldiers might die in one day trying to attack the enemy trenches. The front therefore never really moved. No front line in the West ever moved more than 10 miles in either direction. It was not until the perfection of the tanks with the British Mark I and Mark II from 1916 and the Whippet tank of 1917 that the stalemate of the war could be broken. For World War II, the main characteristics would be blitzkrieg, bombing of the civilians, and war of movement. The Germans had learned from World War I. The new strategy was one of blitzkrieg, lightning attacks. Now the foot soldiers, the infantry, was transported on armored trucks. Before they would be set to fight, Stuka dive bombers and German tanks would crush through the enemy lines, softening up the enemy for the infantry. Then the German columns of attack forces would split and turn around to encircle the enemy. The strategy was immensely effective. The confused enemy found themselves surrounded and had no choice but to surrender. The result was a lower casualty rate on both sides, as the enemy would now be taken prisoner. This tactic turned World War II into a war of movement with rapid advances. Sometimes the Germans would advance 50 miles in one single day. After World War II, governments speculated that the loss of lives could be reduced by improving the standard of the soldiers. While soldiers in World War I would have as little as 2 weeks of training, the US Marine Corps would later train their regular infantry for at least 12 weeks. While this might sound short, the training is very hard, and many soldiers, after having been in combat, still state that the 12 weeks of boot camp was the hardest thing they ever had to do as soldiers. At the same time, there has been a rise in the use of special forces. These soldiers spent years getting a sophisticated warrior education, which includes advanced weaponry and navigation systems, parachuting, survival training, and even basic medical training. The US Navy SEALs spent 1 year on initial training. The British Special Air Service, the SAS, does not even accept soldiers as candidates without them having at least 3 years of military experience. And the Danish Hunter Force spent 16 weeks on just evaluating a potential candidate before accepting him. These soldiers will then work in small groups of 2 to 10 soldiers, sometimes being the only team working on a certain objective deep inside enemy territory. As we can see, the development in ground forces has been towards reducing the numbers of soldiers used. Instead, the soldiers get a better education. We also see how the Blitzkrieg strategy of World War II became immensely effective because different branches of the army were combined. Today, the tendency goes towards reducing the numbers of soldiers even further, instead making them able to survive in enemy territory on specialized sting operations. The one overarching development in strategy during the 20th century has been to combine land, water, and air forces in various setups. Warfare on the oceans is a perfect example of this. Again, we will see a development from static warfare, naval blockades, into mobile warfare. One of the very causes for World War I was an arms race concerning battleships. In 1898, German Kaiser Wilhelm II began building a powerful navy for Germany. This upset the British, who had been used to completely dominating the world's oceans. When the British introduced the mighty dreadnought in 1906, the Germans were quick to build their own. Britain then produced the super dreadnought, and an arms race had begun. When World War I started, Britain had 29 dreadnoughts and Germany 17. But the war at sea was fought mainly through naval blockades. Britain blockaded Germany and vice versa. The German submarines were very effective in shooting down Allied ships. In April 1917, German U-boats were sinking 1 in 4 of all British merchant ships, and Britain only had wheat left for 6 more weeks of war. But Britain and the USA managed to produce more ships than the Germans could sink. 3 times during the war, Germany began campaigns of unrestricted U-boat warfare. It happened in February 1915, in 1916, and in February 1917. In these campaigns, all enemy ships, including civilian merchants and passenger ships, were shot down without warning. Almost 5,000 merchant ships were sunk by U-boats, reaching almost 3 million tons of shipping. Clearly, U-boats were very effective. During World War II, naval strategies changed drastically. Naval vessels were used in combination with ground assault forces, for example the US Marine Corps, or with the Air Force. The Imperial Japanese Navy first launched planes from a ship in 1914, but it was only during World War II that aircraft carriers were really used. The Battle of the Pacific began on December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes attacked the unsuspecting American naval base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Japanese then conquered vast areas in the South Pacific Ocean. To drive back the Japanese, the USA implemented a strategy known as island hopping. Since each Pacific island was heavily defended by the Japanese, it was necessary to use a combination of aircraft carriers, landing vessels, plane attacks, and ground forces. These would all storm the beaches at the same time. The strategy was successful, but when US President Harry S. Truman heard that taking the Japanese mainland might cost the lives of 500,000 US soldiers, he chose instead to drop nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As we can see, naval warfare in World War I was fought mainly through naval blockades and submarine warfare. while in World War II it became a combination of ships, aircraft and landing forces. This happened because both ships and aircraft became capable at traveling longer distances and carrying stronger weapons. The largest aircraft carrier today is the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise CVN-65. It is 342 meters long, can travel for 20 years without refueling, and can hold up to 90 aircraft. Clearly, the combination of aircraft and naval vessels is considered a worthwhile investment. War in the air has developed rapidly during the 20th century, both on its own and in combination with other forces. We see a development which we could characterize by going higher and higher. Each decade, aircraft have become larger or faster or capable of flying longer distances. Weapons have become more and more sophisticated. Today, air superiority is considered being a central strategic element of modern warfare. During World War I, though, aircraft were small, brittle, and slow. In the beginning, planes were used mainly for reconnaissance, and it was not before the Battle of the Messines in June 1917 that planes were used to also attack the soldiers in the trenches. Most aircraft could not fly distances long enough to bomb enemy towns. Only airships, in German Zeppelins, were really capable of doing that. They were basically long cigar-shaped bags of hydrogen gas with a small cabin underneath. Although they could fly relatively high, they were slow and easy to shoot down. They were about 130 meters long, and when hit, the hydrogen inside them would explode. In war, they were largely unsuccessful, but later in the 1930s, the Germans would use Zeppelins on transatlantic flights to the USA and Brazil. At the time of World War II, planes could fly faster and longer and had far better weapons than before. There is a beginning notion of air superiority. Planes were now used by Hitler's Nazi armies in their attacks on the countries of Europe. In another episode, we investigated the success of Blitzkrieg lightning attacks, where Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers combined with panzer and infantry would surround the enemy and take them prisoner. Instead, let's examine the Battle of Britain from July to October 1940. It was now possible to directly attack enemy cities. German Junker Ju-88 bomber planes, a variety of the Ju-87 Stuka, could fly for approximately 90 minutes. With 30 minutes of flight each way, it left them 30 minutes to bomb English towns before having to turn back. But when British Spitfire and Hurricane fighters began attacking them, flight time was lost, and many German bombers ran out of fuel. The early German strategy was to destroy British airfields and air bases in preparation for a later invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. It was therefore an early attempt at achieving air superiority as preparation for a land invasion. The Germans had already done this when they started World War II during the invasion of Poland in September 1939. Attacks before dawn effectively destroyed Polish planes on the ground and disrupted communications, and without air reconnaissance, the Polish army units could not move out of German encirclements. Within 20 days, Poland was defeated. As we now know, the strategy of air superiority has since become a stable tactic of modern warfare. Apart from the obvious examples of the Persian Gulf Wars of 1990-91 and 2003, a good example is reconnaissance, where the 1955 U-2 spy planes, which are still in use, could fly higher than any missile could reach until 1960, when one was shot down over Soviet territory. Today, satellites continually orbit the Earth, taking high-resolution photos of people sunning themselves on their rooftops, which everyone can see on Google Maps. But think about this. If this is what Google can give us for free, what does the American, British, or Russian military really have ready for use in wars? Nuclear war and the strategies attached to it forms an interesting parallel to all the strategies developed in both land, sea, and air war. It is a paradox that these so-called conventional forces were developed even further after the drop of the first atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. One should think that with weapons as devastating as nuclear explosives, where a single 1 megaton bomb will completely destroy anything within a radius of 8 kilometers, all other forces would be obsolete. But the sheer force of nuclear explosives and the decades of radioactive destruction following them simply proved too dangerous to actually use in a conflict. This was the basis for the Cold War, which lasted from 1946 to 1991. The Cold War was basically a war between the superpowers USA and USSR, which, because of both sides having nuclear weapons, was too dangerous to actually fight. Strategies regarding nuclear weapons were numerous. First of all was that of nuclear deterrence. Our nuclear weapons are so powerful that no enemy will dare going into war with us. This strategy only worked for the USA and only from August 1945 until August 1949, when the USSR detonated their own nuclear bomb. From 1954, the USA used the strategy of massive retaliation, that any attack on America would be met with all means possible, including ever stronger nuclear attacks. The result would likely be an exchange of nuclear strikes, culminating in total destruction of the Earth. Strategies also came to involve the speed and effectiveness of delivering the nuclear bombs to the enemy. In May 1957, the USSR developed the first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. From 1959, the USA had followed suit with Atlas and Minuteman ICBMs. From the launch of an ICBM in the USA, it would take only 30 minutes before it would detonate in the USSR, half a world away. Anti-ballistic missiles are missiles designed to shoot down enemy missiles in the air before they could detonate on the ground. Multi-independent re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs, were then developed in response to the ABMs. With MIRV, a missile would split up in several nuclear warheads, and it would be impossible to shoot down all of them before detonation. As an example, an American LGM-118A Peacekeeper missile could carry 10 nuclear warheads, each carrying a 300 kiloton explosive force. Altogether, this would be the same as 230 Hiroshima bombs in one missile. Clearly, these weapons were far too dangerous and soon far too numerous to consider launching. The fear of reprisal was too great, and the price was too high. The old-fashioned war with soldiers, with ships, or with planes was now known as conventional warfare. But nuclear technology crept into all the other branches of war. In land war, it came with proxy wars, where the two superpowers would support each their side in, for example, a civil war. This happened in Korea in 1950 to 53, and in Vietnam in 1955 to 75. In wars at the sea, huge nuclear-powered submarines, such as the 170 meters long USS Ohio, would be fitted with Polaris ICBM or non-nuclear Tomahawk missiles. Basically, only food supplies determine how many months or years it would be able to stay at sea, where it would be able to launch missiles from underwater anywhere in the world. As we can see, nuclear weapons could be said to be the highest point we humans have reached with regards to being able to destroy an enemy. This technology, which makes it possible to actually split atoms, also unleashed a disastrous weapon. These weapons were and are too dangerous to be used, so the strategies involving them have mainly been strategies of deterrence, keeping the enemy from attacking you for fear that he himself would be destroyed. This has meant that conventional forces were still needed just as much as before, although nuclear technology crept its way into these other branches of the army as well. Despite several agreements to disarm nuclear weapons, they still exist, and they still constitute a real danger, as they allow even small nations to keep the world hostage for fear of a nuclear holocaust. In conclusion, what we have seen during the 20th century are changes in technology and strategy, which basically makes for less live soldiers in the field, so to speak, and instead more sophisticated weapons and strategies. What has driven this development? Is it intentionalist, driven by a human desire to be creatively destructive or to dominate the world? Or is the creation of larger and more powerful weapons more of a structuralist nature, driven instead by political, military and economic factors? In most cases, the answer would be structuralist. Governments, especially democratic ones, have a larger chance of maintaining power when the population does not have to go to war. If the country is well protected, no one will invade it. And even if the country does enter a war, military hardware and specially trained elite soldiers will be more efficient both tactically, economically, and in terms of loss of lives. 20th century development in strategy and technology might seem driven towards exterminating life, while actually it is about protecting life, at least that of one's own citizens. If there's one thing World War I taught us, it was that mechanized mass death is not the way to go forward. Must there be conflict, and must this conflict be armed, it is better to spend more money on weapons which will ultimately result in the preservation of lives. In the end, all war is about peace.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century Histories Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro was made by Andrea LaRose, while the music in this episode was made by Border Run. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.